Good morning, everybody. My name is Dan Gilbert, and it is my pleasure and honor to introduce today my good friend, my colleague, my collaborator and co-author, Dan Schacter, who is one of this year's winners of the William James Fellow Award, which you all know is APS's highest honor, recognizing a lifetime of significant intellectual contributions to psychological science. Dan is the William R. Keenan Jr. Professor of Psychology at Harvard University. He's got his PhD under Endel Tulving in 1981 at the University of Toronto, held positions at the University of Toronto and the University of Arizona before joining Harvard Psychology Department in 1991, and we've refused to let him leave since. Among his many honors are the election to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1996, election to the National Academy of Sciences. In 2013, he is a winner of both APA's Early Career Contribution Award, which turned out to be a very fine predictor of his recent receipt in 2012 of APA's Distinguished Scientific Award, its highest honor. William James once wrote, "The stream of thought flows on, but most of its segments fall into the bottomless abyss of oblivion." In some sense, memory is the only thing that keeps our lives from evaporating instantly into time. And Dan Schachter's seminal discoveries have revolutionized our understanding of this most basic human faculty. He's taught us that memory isn't one thing, but it's many things, and that sometimes the memories we can't remember are among the most important and most powerful. He's taught us that the errors and illusions to which memory is prone are windows to its constructive nature, that the reasons memory fails are the same reasons it often works so well. He's taught us that the reason the mind works so hard to preserve its own past is so that it can imagine its future. And he's shown that the cognitive and neural mechanisms that allow us to revisit our yesterdays are very similar to the ones that allow us to pre-visit our tomorrows. From his rigorous laboratory experiments to case studies of amnesic patients to pioneering use of neuroimaging, my friend Dan Schacter has spent the last 35 years robbing nature of her secrets, replacing myth with fact and mystery with knowledge. We are all fortunate to have him. It's a wonderful honor to be able to celebrate his achievements of a lifetime and hear him talk today about adaptive constructive processes in memory and imagination. Please welcome him.
Thank you. Thanks for coming to the talk, and a wonderful introduction by my friend, collaborator, co-author, and colleague, Dan Gilbert. The only downside to being introduced by Dan Gilbert is that the talk is not going to be quite as eloquent as the introduction. That was really well said, and I very much appreciate it. And as I mentioned last night at the award ceremony, it's a wonderful honor to be given this award from APS with special resonance as someone who goes to work every day in William James Hall, and I really view it just as a recognition of work by so many people I've collaborated with over the last 35 to 40 years, and some of that I will illustrate today. But what I want to do is begin by quoting one of my heroes in psychology and memory research who's had really a profound influence on me, and that is the great Sir Frederick Bartlett, who wrote his famous book on remembering back in 1932, and famously said that the first notion that we need to get rid of is that memory is primarily or literally reduplicative or reproductive. In a world of constantly changing environment, he pointed out, literal recall is extraordinarily unimportant, and his resounding conclusion, memory appears to be an affair of construction rather than reproduction. And I think time has proven out Bartlett to be right. Back in 1932, he was kind of a lone voice in the wilderness, putting forth this kind of view of memory, but his fundamental notion, which was motivated by the observations of memory distortions that he documented in his elegant studies of story recall, he proved to be right about memory as a constructive process in the sense of linking together bits and pieces of information from different sources, elements of an episode, prior general knowledge. We pull all that together, and we call that construction and memory. Now, a question that Bartlett addressed back in 1932 and is really one that has been in the forefront of my mind, certainly for the last 20 years, is what are the functions served by a constructive rather than a rotary reproductive memory system? We know well some of the costs. We need look no further than the literature on eyewitness testimony to know how costly memory errors resulting from a constructive memory system can be, but what functions, if any, are there? Why do we have a system that works this way? Well, I've addressed that question in a few different places. About 15 years ago in a book I wrote called The Seven Sins of Memory, a lot of that book, certainly the final chapter, focused on this question, and more recently in an article in Ticks with Peggy St. Jacques and Scott Guerin, we kind of updated and expanded our view on how to address that question. And one of the ideas, and it's been, goes back to Bartlett, and it's been evident in the work of many people in our field, is that maybe one reason we have a constructive memory system is because it does a pretty good job about holding on to the general meaning and themes of experiences. And we typically don't really need to remember all the details of every experience. Sometimes we're better off just remembering the general meaning or the gist, even though doing so can sometimes be costly if that's all we take away from an experience. That can lead to memory distortion. So this is one idea that I and many others have discussed. And one very nice example of that we've seen play out now over the last 20 years comes from a paradigm that pretty much everyone in psychology now knows very well, the famous Dease, Roediger, McDermott, or DRM, false recognition of associates paradigm, originated with Dease back in the late 50s and then revived and modified and expanded in a very influential way by Roediger and McDermott in 1995. Paradigm needs no introduction, but as you know, subjects see or hear a list of highly semantically associated words: candy, sour, sugar, bitter, good, taste, tooth, etc., etc. And then later on, they're given a memory test, typically a recall test or a recognition test. In the recognition test, you might show them a word from the list, such as taste. Unrelated words that weren't presented and have nothing to do with what was presented, such as point, and of course the associatively related theme word or critical lure, false target as it's often called, sweet. And the critical phenomenon is that people make very high levels of false alarms to the theme word accompanied by high confidence. So some early data from my lab from an experiment that was done by Ken Norman back when he was a graduate student in the lab comparing healthy young adults and older adults, you can see that the proportion of old responses to that false target, sweet, that wasn't on the list is at least as high as the proportion of old responses to words like taste that were on the list. And interestingly, older adults showed even a higher level of false alarming to the critical lure word than did young adults. Baseline false alarms to unrelated words are way down, around 10%. So it's a massive false memory effect expressed with high confidence. And false recognition here seems to be based on memory for semantic information or semantic relations. And older adults may retain this information and rely on it perhaps even more than younger adults. Okay, now I want to flash forward 20 years and tell you about some more recent work that I think illustrates some interesting, important points about this DRM phenomenon. So if semantic information and relations are critical in driving the DRM false memories, and there are various ways theoretically of accounting for it, but most of them would subscribe to that general notion, then brain regions that are involved in representing this kind of information and relation should play a role in false recognition of the critical lure word. If it's really a byproduct of semantic representational processes that are very important for us to understand the world around us, but can lead to this error. And one region that has been of great interest in cognitive neuroscience with respect to semantic information and semantic processing is the temporal pole, shown there in orange at the very anterior extent of the temporal lobe. And the temporal pole, particularly the left temporal pole, has been called by many people for many reasons the semantic hub of the brain. We know, among other things, that when there is damage to the left temporal pole, that is often associated with the striking phenomenon of semantic dementia, where patients have a relatively encapsulated deficit in processing semantic information, even though other abilities are left intact. And what I want to tell you about now is a recent interesting study that I was involved in as a collaborator with Demis Hassabis's group at DeepMind in London. Martin Chadwick took the lead on this paper, came out a few months back in PNAS, that examines the link between the left temporal pole and DRM false memories. So the conceptual basis for this paper, expanding on what I just said a minute ago, is that computational models of semantic cognition, many of them hold that concepts are represented by a similarity-based code in the temporal pole semantic hub. At least that's a big part of it, not the only brain region, but a key brain region. And these, thus, from that, we might say that neural representations of words on a DRM list should reflect that semantic relatedness between those words in the temporal pole. So putting those thoughts together, that leads to a pretty straightforward prediction, and that is that the probability that a given DRM list of associates will generate a false memory should be directly, positively related to the degree of neural overlap among the words in that list in the temporal pole. Now, one important feature of the DRM phenomenon, Roddy Roediger certainly has pointed this out many times, and it goes all the way back to Deese, is that some DRM lists yield very high levels of false memories, others yield much lower levels. So this experiment is going to try to take advantage of that particular feature. And the study used an increasingly popular kind of analysis in fMRI studies, representational similarity analysis, which measures neural pattern similarity across multiple voxels in an fMRI study between pairs of stimuli as a basis for inferring representational similarity. So you're going to use this kind of analysis to look at the overlap in voxel patterns elicited by various items when people are processing them in the scanner. And so in this study, we measured neural overlap between each set of 4 DRM words. We didn't use the entire 15-word list for practical reasons, but you still get a robust false memory effect even when you use 4 of the highest associates. So neural overlap was measured when people were processing 4 DRM words and the associated critical lure while making semantic judgments about them. So this is not going to be the false memory part of the experiment because people are seeing the critical lure and the 4 associated words. But critically, each of these sets is associated with a different probability of generating a false memory. Now, if the prediction is correct, then activity in the temporal pole should display a positive correlation and direct correspondence between the degree of neural overlap during semantic encoding and false memory likelihood. So the more the neural overlap from this view, the higher the probability of a false memory. So in this study, the main analysis used false memory estimates for each list that were based on canonical false recognition data from other people. It comes from some norms published by Roediger and colleagues back in 2001. But we also obtained false memory data from subjects in the scanner in a separate session that was conducted weeks to months before scanning. And here's the critical result. On the left, you can see the left temporal pole area in which the correlation on the right is obtained. And the critical point here is that the canonical false memory likelihood shown on the y-axis is indeed positively correlated with the degree of semantic overlap, neural overlap, measured by representational similarity analysis between the critical lure and its 4 associates. And that is indeed predictive of the likelihood of a false memory. More false memory, a greater false memory likelihood, associated with greater temporal pole neural overlap. Critically, you can do a searchlight analysis going through the entire brain. This is the only region in the brain that shows this relationship, but it doesn't turn up anywhere else. So it's specific to the predicted area of the temporal pole. And the temporal pole seems to also contain participant-specific neural information that predicts false memories in individuals based on their own false memory responses above and beyond the canonical data. So you get it both from false memories of subjects in the experiment and when you relate neural similarity measures to the canonical false recognition data. Okay, so coming back to the question, what functions are served by a constructive rather than a rote reproductive memory system? Here we see that the same brain region that is encoding semantic information and relations, what we think of as an adaptive process, is linked to false memories resulting from that process. And this really exemplifies what I've defined, characterized as an adaptive constructive process in the tradition of many others going before me. Whoa. I think it... Okay, trying to get me online there. And I define it as a process that plays a functional role in memory and cognition, but produces distortions, errors, or illusions as a consequence of doing so. So what I want to now move onto for the remainder of the talk is a domain where I think we see some very interest to get a different perspective on adaptive constructive processes. And here I'm going to be focusing on what I refer to as flexible recombination processes and imagining future experiences. So about a decade ago, my lab, based on a few interests around in the lab, some older interests of mine, did an experiment. It was led by Donna Rose-Addis, then a postdoc in the lab, where we put people in an fMRI scanner and did something pretty simple. People were given keywords, simple keywords, and they were asked to either remember a specific past experience related to that keyword that occurred, say, within the past year, imagine a novel future experience that could plausibly occur related to that keyword that might occur within the next year. And in control conditions, they were given the same kind of keywords, and they were asked to either carry out visuospatial processing or semantic processing control tasks that did not involve remembering or imagining a full episode. And as you can see in the slide, this is just part of the data that were obtained from this experiment. There is a striking overlap there when people are remembering past events. Regions that become active above and beyond the control condition are very similar to those that become active above and beyond the control condition when people are imagining future experiences. Midline regions most prominent here, the posterior regions including retrosplenial cortex and posterior cingulate, the anterior regions centering on the medial prefrontal cortex. At the same time, a couple of other fMRI studies, one from Kathleen McDermott and Carl Spooner, an earlier one from Yuri Okuda, were showing the same thing. Dan Gilbert and Tim Wilson in 2007 wrote their important science paper on how memory can impact affective forecasting and predictions about the future. Hassabis and McGuire published some really interesting data showing deficits in imagination in amnesic patients, and a whole bunch of things came together to suggest that there's an important link between remembering the past and imagining the future. In another 2007 paper written with Addis and Randy Buckner, we postulated the existence of what we refer to in this paper as a core network that's involved in remembering past events, imagining future events, and supporting related kinds of mental simulations. So those midline regions I showed you from the Addis study are prominent members of this network, as well as lateral temporal cortex, the medial temporal lobe, and lateral parietal cortex, all regions where in the Addis fMRI study we saw common activation for remembering the past and imagining the future. And of course, cognitive neuroscientists in the audience will immediately see that this core network is very similar to, overlaps substantially with the well-known default mode network or default network, and the two are pretty much the same thing. At the time, we only had a couple of studies to go on to make this proposal. It's been a very active area of research. There are many more studies nowadays, and in 2015, Roland Benoit, who's then a postdoc in my lab, and I did a meta-analysis of the existing fMRI studies that basically confirms the joint involvement of this core network in episodic memory and episodic simulation, or episodic future thinking. Okay, so let's link some of this back now to the constructive memory theme. And that's where an idea that Addis and I put forward in 2007 as well, a very active year for us on this topic, an idea we call the constructive episodic simulation hypothesis, that's going to get us back to thinking about constructive memory and how imagining the future might relate to constructive memory. So our notion, which was building on earlier ideas from Endel Tulving, who of course is the father of the term episodic memory, created it and also talked about its role in mental time travel. We argued that at least some of these similarities that we and others were seeing between remembering the past and imagining the future reflect the important role that episodic memory plays in supporting imagining possible future scenarios. Again, we often refer to that as episodic simulation or episodic future thinking. And critically, it does so by supporting what we call flexible retrieval and recombination of elements of stored episodes to construct possible future episodes. So the idea is that we want a flexible memory system that allows us to take bits and pieces of past experience and recombine them in new ways to project ahead to the future. And flexible recombination, we argued, is adaptive when we're trying to use memory for the purpose of future simulation, because the future is rarely identical to the past. We need to imagine new situations, and we want to apply our past experience as best we can to these new situations. So we need to be able to simulate novel situations based on past experience. However, we argued also that flexible recombination can also result in memory errors when elements of past experience are miscombined. So I want to look at both sides of this. First, the issue of the adaptive aspects of episodic simulation, and then come back to this question of whether the flexible recombination process that we think is critical to episodic simulation is implicated in memory errors as we hypothesize. So that's where our link to constructive memory comes in. Okay. Adaptive functions of episodic simulation. There is a growing literature on this that I think is steadily making the case that despite not being a perfect process, we certainly know that from Gilbert and Wilson's work on errors in affective forecasting, episodic simulation does serve a variety of adaptive functions. I reviewed some of that early evidence in a paper that came out in American Psychologist in 2012. And for those of you who are interested in an update on this issue, I'll flag a paper that hopefully with some minor revision will be coming out soon in a special issue of Current Opinion in Behavioral Sciences written with Roland Benoit and Carl Spooner. I can't go through all the literature. I just want to touch briefly on two parts of it that I think are particularly interesting and promising. One has to do with what I'll refer to as far-sighted decision-making, making decisions about things that might occur to us, actions that we could take, behaviors that we can engage in the near versus the far future. And there's a very well-established phenomenon known as temporal discounting, which reflects the fact that people tend to devalue a reward according to the extent of the delay until that reward is delivered. And this often results in a preference for a smaller immediate reward versus a larger delayed reward. That's temporal discounting. So people can often behave impulsively, even though they could just be a little bit more patient and farsighted, there'd be a bigger payoff in the long run. Large literature on temporal discounting. But what a number of studies have shown is that if you imagine or simulate an episode involving the reward, where you can actually simulate some of the features of a big reward that makes it worth waiting for, then you get a relative increase in preference for the larger delay reward. You get more far-sighted decision-making, more patient responding, less impulsive responding. And in a very nice study by Benoit, this is actually before he came to my lab, they were able to show not only that behavioral phenomenon that I just described, but they produced some nice fMRI evidence showing that the reduction in temporal discounting produced by episodic simulation is associated with increased coupling between two key members of the core network that we talked about, the hippocampus and the shown on the right, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. This literature has really sort of exploded in the last few years, and I even wasn't aware of how much it had done so until writing this recent current opinion paper. And one of the most impressive areas where there's been an extension of this work on episodic simulation and temporal discounting has been to the domain of eating behavior, where there's now a very impressive literature showing that episodic simulation of future events can bias dietary decisions, both in obese and non-obese individuals, away from immediate food rewards and toward fulfilling longer-term health goals related to weight loss. And these effects are observed both when people just think about the future in general, or they specifically simulate health-related or eating-related behaviors. The effects are bigger in the latter case than the former. I just call your attention here to a couple of nice 2016 papers, one from Len Epstein's lab, Len's lab has been very active in this area, showing that episodic future thinking actually reduces eating among obese individuals in an actual food court situation where they're tempted, and another one from Dassin and colleagues showing something very similar. Okay, let me just give a second example of these adaptive aspects of episodic simulation and future thinking, which comes from the domain of emotion regulation and social problem solving. We all know from everyday experience, and it's well established in the psychological literature, that worry about the future can be quite disruptive to psychological functioning. No surprise there. But what's interesting now is that there's some indication of ways in which episodic simulation might be used to mitigate some of these damaging effects. So in several studies in my lab that I'll only briefly summarize here, we found that people can produce more detailed episodic simulations of future events after they receive something that we call an episodic specificity induction, which is basically brief training in recollecting episodic details and after receiving various control inductions. This is work that's been led by Kevin Medore in the lab. Brendan Gesser's played a role in this work, as well as others I'll talk about in a minute. So what is this brief training? So people come into the lab in one of these studies, they see a video of people doing routine actions in a kitchen, and then in the episodic specificity induction condition, they're given an adaptive version of the well-known cognitive interview, which was developed a little over 25 years ago now by Fisher and Geiselman at UCLA. And it's basically a protocol for pulling episodic detail out of eyewitnesses, hopefully accurate detail. And that is what we give to subjects an adaptive version of that. So now they're thinking back to the video and they're being asked about details about what people did, how they looked, actions that occurred, the sequence of events. So they're really unpacking episodic detail. In the control condition, they're thinking back to the same video, but they're just giving their general impressions and how well made you think the video was. And the striking effect, now we've replicated it many times in cognitive studies and recently in neuroimaging studies, is that after you've had this kind of induction, there are consistent and selective downstream effects on tasks that draw on episodic retrieval. So after you've just had the specificity induction, you'll imagine a future event in more episodic detail. You can come up with more steps in a problem-solving task. We've even shown effects on divergent creative thinking, but it's selective. It doesn't just affect every task. It doesn't affect tasks that are more semantically based, and it selectively impacts or targets episodic measures. So a question that arose after we had done a few of these studies in my lab was, well, do detailed episodic future simulations improve problem solving and emotion regulation regarding worrisome future events? So this is work led by Helen Jing, a graduate student in the lab. Kevin Medora is also involved in this. Anyone who wants all the details, paper came out in JP General last year. But I'll just give you a brief overview. So they come into the lab. These are Harvard undergraduates. They come in for a first session, and they're asked to list 30 specific concrete problems or events that are highly worrisome to them. Harvard undergraduates have no problem coming up with lots of things that they're worried about. They're a very worried group. So this would be typical. I'm worried about doing poorly on the final for my psychology class because that would bring down my GPA. Well, what is the positive outcome you hope will happen for this event? Well, I get an A on my final. And what's the negative outcome you fear would happen for this event? I fail the final. It brings down my grade in the class. So that's session 1. Then they come back for sessions 2 and 3, where in one of those sessions they get a specificity induction and the other a control induction. We always do these experiments within participants and counterbalance the order. So they see the video, they get a specificity induction, and after that they go on to do some problem-solving tasks. I'll give you an example of that, and also some what we call episodic reappraisal tasks where they're trying to reframe the worrisome event. And then they do the same thing after a control induction a week later, and again, order counterbalanced. So just to give you a flavor for the problem-solving task, it's an adaptive version of a task that was published initially in the literature by Platt and Spivak in 1975. We call it a personal means-end problem-solving task, where there are 6 personal problem stories involving a thing they're worried about, and they have 5 minutes to generate steps to reach a positive outcome. So you'd like to do well on your psychology, upcoming psychology final. The story begins with you worrying about your psychology final. The story ends with you getting an A. Please fill in the middle of the story. This is how Platt and Spivak structured their means-end problem-solving task, and we apply it to these worrisome future events. And here's the critical finding. We code for the number of relevant steps that they come up with to solve the problem. Blind coders in high agreement rate those. And other steps are kind of irrelevant steps that really don't move you closer to the goal. And the critical finding is after you've just had a specificity induction, you're now coming up with more relevant steps to solving the problem. And it's not just that you're spewing out more information because there's no effect on other steps. In fact, other steps, the irrelevant ones, go down. So it's not that they're just verbalizing more, they're producing more constructive behaviors and relevant steps when they're simulating this event in more episodic detail. So they generate the more constructive steps, they're better able to reappraise or reframe the problem on an episodic reappraisal task, similar pattern of results, and they also show pre-post increases on several measures of subjective well-being. So, I think now we can say that, I'll just give you 2 examples, there are several lines of evidence that episodic simulation serves adaptive functions. For my remaining time, I want to focus on the other side of the coin. So again, a critical idea from the beginning in the constructive episodic simulation perspective has been that the very same flexible retrieval and recombination processes that serve these adaptive functions that we've just been talking about serve the adaptive function of constructing novel event representations that support episodic simulation and related function, that these very same processes can also contribute to memory errors when elements of different experiences are miscombined. That's the downside of our flexible constructive memory system. Well, we've never really had any direct evidence on it. It's kind of a nice idea, but it would be nice to have some evidence for it. Well, we've got the evidence now. Thanks to the efforts of a graduate student in my lab, Alexis Carpenter, who has led a very interesting line of work, just came out in Journal of Experimental Psychology, Learning, Memory, and Cognition, for those who want the details. And this line of work makes use of an associative inference paradigm that I want to describe to you in some detail. So I'm going to go through this experimental paradigm in some detail. So hang with me because it's worth it. It's a very cool result, but you only see that it's a cool result if you follow me through the steps of the paradigm. Okay, so associative inference, broadly defined, would be an adaptive process that allows us to combine related information acquired in distinct episodes to make novel connections that we haven't directly experienced. We see two individuals walking a dog, the same dog on different days. We can combine those things to infer there's some kind of link between these people. They're walking the same dog. Experimentally, this is the example I'm going to use, so we'll get used to looking at it. You see this man with a construction toy, and there's a direct relationship between the two. We'll call that the AB pair. And you see the little boy with that same construction toy. We'll call that a BC pair. The B item is the construction toy, and the boy is the C item. So you learn those two things directly, and you can make an inference that there's some kind of link between the man and the boy. They're both holding that same construction toy. So that's the inference process. Now we know from very elegant studies from Shohami and Wagner back in 2008, Ali Preston's lab with Zaitomova and others, in a series of studies, that the hippocampus plays a role in supporting this kind of associative inference. And we, in our fMRI studies of future simulation, have linked the hippocampus to flexible recombination. So we think that this is a good paradigm for looking at an adaptive process, associative inference, that relies on a critical member of the core network, the hippocampus. So exactly how does this work? Exactly how, what are the mechanisms? It's important conceptually here to distinguish between two different ways in which that associative inference could be successful. Number one, I'm going to call integrative encoding. So when the boy and the construction toy are presented, you've seen the man and the construction toy, AB might be reactivated. You think, oh yeah, I remember there was a guy with a construction toy. You infer that link, and now you can store an integrated unit, an integrated ABC unit. So I've seen the man and the construction toy. A little while later, the boy and the construction toy come along. That reactivates the earlier memory. I put them together, and now I integratively encode an ABC unit. Okay, so that's one way. And then later on, when I ask you, I give you an inference test. Now you've got that whole thing stored as an integrative unit, and you know darn well that the boy and the man are related because that's how you've stored it. The second mechanism I'm going to call the flexible retrieval and recombination. And from this perspective, you don't necessarily do that integrative encoding. AB comes along, BC comes along, you don't make the link at that point, but then I give you a test. I say, is there a link? And now you've got to engage in flexible recombination in order to make the successful inference and combine these previously studied A and B and BC, AB and BC pairs. The literature shows evidence for both mechanisms. They can operate maybe even within the same individual. But what we're interested in is isolating this flexible retrieval recombination process. That's really our core thing. We want to see if that's related to memory errors. Okay, so the hypothesis is that the capacity for flexible retrieval and recombination can support inference across related events. but it might also leave memory prone to error distortion, such as source misattributions, where details of a related event are mistakenly attributed to memory for the original event. So what we're saying is, yeah, there's an upside to that flexible recombination. You can make the inference, but doing so might make you more prone to mixing up elements of those two different episodes and making a memory error. So I'm going to tell you about 4 experiments. I'm really just going to tell you about 1 and then 3 replications and extensions. Used an ABBC associative inference paradigm to test this hypothesis that it's the flexible retrieval and recombination process that supports successful inference that also produces false memory. When it's working well for you is when it also gets you into trouble. So here's an overview of the experiment. 2 different sessions separated by a 24-hour delay. Young adults, healthy young adults in this experiment. Session 1, they encode the AB items, the man in the construction toy, the BC items, the boy in the construction toy, and those are in 2 separate blocks. The details here aren't critically important, but what is critically important is that the images depict everyday life events, as I'll show you in a second. So you've got the man and the boy, or a man and the toy, or the boy and the construction toy in an everyday scene superimposed on background. So here we are. There's the man in the construction toy. He's in a living room, and there are various things we could ask you about that living room, but just pay attention now to the fact that it's a white couch. That's important. Later on, in a different block, you're going to see the boy in the construction toy. He's also in a living room. There are various things we can ask you about that living room, but just pay attention to the fact for now that it's a brown couch. That's important. And during encoding, everything is sort of given away to the participants. They're told, following previous work from Preston's lab, we're going to test you on the A, B, and BC associative. We're going to ask you about whether the man and the construction toy, boy and the construction toy, go together. They know that we're going to ask them about whether there's these cross-episode links, and they're also told that they're going to be asked about the scene details. So they know all this going in. Then they come back for session 2 the next day, and this is the critical manipulation of the experiment. Now you get a multiple choice and source test, questions about the peripheral details like the couch, and I'll show you that in a minute, for half of the studied items. Then you get the associative inference test and the directly learned trials as well, and then we test you on the other half of the source details. So there's a before and after the inference test manipulation that is really crucial here. Okay, so what does that source test look like? You would be asked now, what color was the couch? You're given a choice between brown and white, 2 things you saw, and then gray, something you never saw. And of course, the correct answer is white, but you could say brown because you did see brown in that other scene. So the correct answer again is white. You're going to get credit for that. The misinformation answer that we're most interested in is when you say brown. So if you're now claiming this guy was in a room with a brown couch, we further ask you, okay, well, we ask you in all cases, where do you remember seeing this information? And if you say it was in the first set of images, which it wasn't, that was a white couch, or you say, I remember it was in both the first and second set, that's got some misinformation in it too, then you're going to get, now you've got a full-blown source false memory. You're claiming you saw this guy with a brown couch in the first set of images. That gets you in the false memory bin. Okay, there's also, so you get that. Now we're going to ask you about, to the more standard thing that people do in these inference experiments. So after you've had the first half of those kinds of questions about the source details, you're now going to be asked about the associative inference and directly learned items. So that's best illustrated by example. So for the inference item, you'd say, which of these 2 boys was that guy related to? Both of them appeared somewhere, but obviously the link is with the boy on the left via the construction toy. So that would be a correct inference if you choose that guy and not that guy. And we also want to make sure that, or assess the extent to which you learned the association, the direct association. So now again, we're going to ask you which of these two objects was this guy paired with. They both appeared at some point, but obviously he was paired with the construction toy. So it's source memory test for half, associative inference and directly learned for everything, source memory test for the other half after the associative inference test. That's when the second half of the source monitoring question comes. Now let's walk through the hypotheses, and then I will finally show you some data. So a flexible retrieval leading to successful inference also increases susceptibility to false memories. Then the proportion of source misattribution should be higher for correct and incorrect inference trials, right? So you should make more source memory confusions when you get the inference right than when you get it wrong, but only when the source test is given after the inference test, because that's where flexible recombination is occurring. Integrative encoding, remember that's the other way this could happen. When the second set of images comes up, you think back to the first set and you store that integrative three-way trace. So if that's what is going to increase susceptibility to false memories, the proportion of source misattribution should be higher for correct and incorrect. You're going to make more mistakes when you get the inference right than when you get it wrong, but both before and after the inference test. Critical difference between the two. And finally, of course, it's possible that we're just barking up the wrong tree here. Maybe there's no relationship whatsoever between successful inference and false memories, so then there shouldn't be any differences in source misattributions for correct and incorrect inference trials, regardless of when the inference test is given. And for the critical false memory analysis, we only look at items that were correct on the directly learned trial. So we want to be sure you got the basic association, and that only those go into the false memory analysis. Okay, so all that for a little bit of data. What do we see? Well, this is the proportion of false memories, the portion of times they're claiming that the guy was in a room with a brown couch, and that it appeared in the first set of images. So these pass the false memory criterion. There are a little over 20% of those for incorrect inferences, both before and after. Now, are you going to get a bump? Are you going to make more mistakes when you get the inference right? Yes, you do, but only after the inference test. So you get that critical time by inference interaction. You're making more false memories when you get the inference right, but only when the source memory test comes right after you've done the flexible recombination. So we go back to our three hypotheses. There's only one man standing here, and that's the flexible retrieval process. That's the only hypothesis that predicts that interaction. Is that interaction reliable? Yup, turns out it is. So there are three more experiments that basically do theme and variations on the paradigm I just told you about. The sessions are separated by 48 instead of 24 hours. Some slight change in instructions in experiment 2. A delay is interposed between the inference test and the second source memory test in experiment 3 to see does this effect last. And in experiment 4, we only test the inference items, not the directly learned items, between the two source memory tests to make sure that those aren't playing any role in the critical effect, and it's really the inference items that is critical. And basically, that's the data I showed you in the first experiment, and it replicates 3 times under these different variations. So it's always that same pattern, that same interaction, more false memories when you get the inference right than when you get it wrong, but only after you've just engaged in flexible recombination. So the results suggest that recombination during retrieval may lead to source memory error. Why is this happening? Well, the idea is that when people make a correct inference about the relationship between elements that have not been experienced together previously, they may more fully recombine the details from the 2 episodes, such those details from one migrate to the other and become incorporated in the wrong episode when you get the inference right. You're paying a price. So we think this provides evidence for a critical idea of the constructive episodic simulation view that flexible recombination can support the construction of adaptive novel event representations that allow you to make useful inferences, but they also increase memory errors. And it's not just these source details. Alexis has some very interesting recent data showing that the same thing happens with value details, where you say this guy is worth a lot and the little boy is not worth much. If you make an inference, you're going to claim it's the little boy who was the highly rewarded item in the same manner that we just saw. And if you want to hear more about some interesting work from Alexis on how this all relates to insight learning, go to her poster from 1:30 to 2:20 today. So to conclude then, 3 major conclusions. First part of the talk, we saw that the semantic hub based in the left temporal pole represents semantic information with a similarity-based code and is linked to false recognition of critical lures in the DRM paradigm. Second, we saw that flexible retrieval and recombination processes support adaptive uses of episodic simulation and future thinking. We talked about far-sighted decision-making, solving worrisome problems, but they're also linked with memory errors, as we just saw, source and value details. And finally, I think that more generally, this whole set of studies makes the point that functional and constructive aspects of memory and imagination are tightly intertwined, and that studying these adaptive constructive processes can advance our understanding of both the mechanisms and the functions of memory and imagination. And in closing, I want to thank members of my current lab, collaborators on the work I talked about today, and all former members of Schacter Lab, as well as funding sources. And thank you for your attention. Okay, thanks for coming.